so.
Well, now on the Heart Shoulder, we want to turn to the issue of renewable electricity generation with particular reference to Irish wind energy. We recently had the Wind Energy Association's David Connolly on the show in relation to their policy launch called 70-30, which was that by 2030, 70% of our electricity would come from renewable sources. But disagreeing with this is the organisation of Wind Aware Ireland, and their PRO, Paula Byrne, got in touch with the programme to set out their views, and she joins me now in studio. Paula, what's the issue as far as you're concerned?
Good afternoon, Ivan. Well, I suppose the issue is that wind energy is a hopelessly inefficient way of reducing CO2 emissions that has significant impacts on people and on the environment, and it's costing billions. So I suppose the big context is that wind sometimes produces electricity, but electricity is responsible only for about 1/5 of our CO2 emissions. As a result of that, wind is saving about 4% of our CO2 emissions. So it's in that context that this conversation is taking place, 4% of our CO2 emissions. Now, for example, if Money Point Power Station were converted from coal to gas, it would save the same amount of CO2 emissions as all the wind turbines currently constructed. So we would ask the question, when Eamon Ryan was signing us up in 2006 to targets that we know now we're not going to meet, they are unrealistic, why was that option of converting Money Point not considered? And we believe that it was not considered because no analysis was undertaken at the time, and because no hard questions were asked about this rush to wind energy.
Okay. Well, gas and coal, just park that to one side, because the issue of fossil fuels is something that, on the Down to Earth programme, Cara, Gustenberg and other people have been very vocal about. And as you know, we're facing EU funds. Let's just focus on your problems with wind turbines. What exactly is your objection to them?
So our objection is that the tiny benefits in terms of CO2 savings are outweighed by the enormous negative impacts. So that's in terms of people having to leave their homes, in terms of environmental impacts and habitats impacts. For example, 2 of our groups have taken cases on the Habitat Directive all the way to the European Court of Justice and have won. In terms of people, we know that families have left their homes because of noise and infrasound issues. There was a large case in Cork a number of years ago where 7 families, after 5 years fighting in the High Court, settled with a wind farm operator. We don't know what that settlement was, but we do know that there are noise problems in Roscommon, in Slieve in Wicklow, in Raheenlee, in Limerick.
And is noise the biggest issue?
No, it is a cumulative effect of noise, environmental impacts and the enormous costs. We are spending billions upon billions. We estimate about 1.2 billion per year in direct and indirect subsidies to the wind industry, which is saving, as I said, only about 4% of our CO2 emissions. So we think that other alternatives have not been looked at because hard questions have not been asked by politicians largely, and largely by the media as well. There has been a consensus on wind.
Okay, and what do you say to say that for any wind farm to be established either onshore or offshore, it has to go through a planning process with a local authority, with Bord Pleanála, maybe impact assessments, and therefore some of the concerns you have is such as proximity to someone's home and that kind of thing. Are there not guidelines now that we're further down the road on this, with almost 4,000 megawatts, that there are protections for people that weren't there originally?
So the guidelines, the planning guidelines, are hopelessly out of date. They date from 2006, and they allow a wind turbine, which now, if anyone would like to kind of understand the size of these, the spire in the centre of Dublin is 120 metres tall. Wind turbines are now heading for 180 metres, 150, 60, 80 metres. But that is not the substantive issue. The substantive issue is that the benefits of wind in terms of saving 4% of our CO2 do not balance out the negative impacts on the environment, on the cost, the sheer cost, 1.2 billion per year, and on people having to abandon their homes. And it should not be.
If, for example, the setback distance, that you could not put a wind turbine within X distance. That wouldn't put someone out of their home then, surely. In other words, if you get a more remote area, or if you do offshore development, which is not near anyone, you can actually build that into the planning process. In other words, you can have the wind farms and not have the discommoding of people.
Why would you continue with a wind energy policy when it is hopelessly failing to reduce our CO2 emissions? Planning is only one small part of the issue. The bigger substantive issues are the costs on the environment, on the economy and on people. And it doesn't really matter where you're going to put the wind turbines. You cannot address those issues no matter how far. Maybe a greater distance will improve the issue with noise. Maybe it won't. We don't know.
Is it not the case that proponents of wind farms now incorporate a community dividend benefit into them so that some of the profits are put back into local community facilities? Is that not the case?
No, it is not the case. It's a proposal in a new policy from the department. However, the proposal is not going to be mandatory, and our communities do not want to be. It's an attempt at bribery. If you had to pay people to accept something, if it was so good, why would you have to pay them to accept it? It is not good for the economy, it's not good for the environment, and it's not good for people who have to abandon their homes because
and what would you say to say that, look, in terms of Ireland's natural resources, we have our green countryside, our agriculture, our tourism, but one of the things is that we're, a windswept island, and therefore it is a natural resource to harvest this wind, and therefore, we don't have, apart from Shelter Sea, we don't have much oil wells or whatever. We import all that, and that therefore this is availing of a natural resource.
So I go back to the point that wind energy sometimes produces electricity. And when the wind is not blowing, there is no electricity from wind. So that means that 100% of your electricity still has to come from fossil fuels or whatever other sources. That's in the short term. A new study came out in Europe which looked at 10 countries over a 15-year period. They looked at solar PV, hydro and wind. In the long term, while solar PV and hydro reduced dependence on fossil fuel generation, wind actually increased or maintained dependence on fossil fuel generation. So we're not solving any problem by introducing more and more wind, as is proposed. We are only maintaining our dependence on fossil fuels because wind only produces electricity some of the time.
And the wind doesn't blow all the time. But what about the issue that, as we look down the road at these EU fines and so on, that one of the big things is actually something like electric cars, which would be a game changer. So therefore, any form of electricity generation has the double benefit, not only within the economics of electricity generation, but also reducing transport-related emissions.
So what you're saying is that something that is at the moment hypothetical, pie in the sky, never been done anywhere in the world before, is what we should base policy on. We need to base policy on facts, figures, hard evidence of what we know now. So maybe electric cars will come, they're less than 1%, I think, at the moment. Maybe, but at the moment it's pure hypothesis.
They are thinking like there's problems with batteries and charging points and all. Yeah. They are like the Scandinavian countries, the way of the future. And I think there's some rule by 2030 we all have to be driving some sort of hybrid or something like that.
So you still have the problem of intermittency of wind. The wind doesn't always blow. The ESB, in front of the Oireachtas Committee recently, pointed out that to store electricity for one day in Ireland, we would need 60 Turlock Hills or 14 million Tesla power walls. In America, the battery storage that has been introduced in 2018 would store electricity for 6 seconds of American demand. That's where we're at with storage, and that's where we're at with wind. It is a hopelessly inefficient way of reducing CO2 emissions. The impacts are far too large and it's too costly.
Okay, well, a few weeks ago you heard the views of the Irish Wind Energy Association. Today you heard the views of Wind Aware Ireland and their PRO, Paula Byrne. Thank you for joining us on the programme. And that's all we have for you.